All right. Hi, everyone. So welcome to our webinar about Sericea lespedeza. Again, this is, how to identify it and how to eradicate it. So Emily, if you want to move on to the next slide. So a quick overview on what we're going to go through in the webinar today. We're going to talk about what is Sericea lespedeza, its history, why it's invasive, and some misconceptions about it. Then we're going to go into identification, and then finally into management and talk about mowing and disking, prescribed fire, herbicide, and grazing. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So, what is Sericea lespedeza? And yes, this is unfortunately its common name, but you may know it as something else. It is also known as Chinese lespedeza, Chinese bush clover, silky bush clover, and hairy lespedeza. So then now let's talk about an overview of it. Sericea. Sericea is a warm season perennial forb. Warm season meaning most of its growth happens in the hot late spring, early summer conditions, and then it blooms in the late summer. Perennial meaning it returns every year. It goes dormant in the winter and then it grows again in the spring. It is native to Eastern Asia, and then it is spread by its seeds are spread by animals and equipment. So I wanted to put this up. This is the phenology calendar for Illinois, which is basically at what point of the year is the plant in its growth cycle. So as you can see in late March to May, it is that first emergence, that new growth. And then in June through August, it starts growing its flowers and producing flowers. And then September and October, it is creating seeds and the seeds are maturing. And then in November, it becomes dormant. So its history. Sericea was first of all, it is a very tolerant plant of drought and low fertility soils. And so it was brought into the US from Eastern Asia in the 1890s. And it was brought to use as a cover crop for sites with low fertility soils, and was also promoted to be used as a wildlife food plot and forage for livestock. And it was not considered, and it was not realized to be such a major problem until the 1980s. So this map here, this green is its native range. As you can see, it covers the majority of Eastern Asia, along with a few islands and the eastern part of Australia. This map is its current known distribution in the United States. As you can see, it's most of the Midwest, pretty much all of the South, and a lot of the East, as well as going up into Canada. Now, I wanted to put up this world map to kind of show, because a lot of people ask, well, how does this Eastern Asian plant that evolved there and is originally from there, why does it do so well in North America? Well, that's because it is pretty much along the same line of latitude as its native range as it is in North America. So that means we have a lot of the same climate conditions as they do in Eastern Asia. So it can grow really well here, and it doesn't have that competition that it evolved with in its native range. So why is it bad? Sericea is a very aggressive plant, and it's really good at outcompeting the native plants. And it does really well at forming extensive monocultures. Additionally, Sericea is a legume, but unlike other legumes, it doesn't have that symbiotic relationship with bacteria that helps take nitrogen from the air and fix it and put it back into the soil. So the Sericea is taking all this nitrogen from the soil and not doing what the native Sericea and other legumes do and putting it back into the soil. Additionally, Sericea produces a chemical that inhibits the seed germination and growth of any nearby plants. because the soil is released from the Sericia's roots and picked up by the nearby plants, which really stunts them. And it also reduces their quality as forage for any livestock or native wildlife in the area. So another slide on why it's bad. Sericea has really deep woody tap roots. They go about 3 to 4 feet deep, and they have a really wide spread of offshoot roots. So these tap roots allow it to soak up water before the native plants, and it needs a lot of water, Sericea does. And so this is really bad in drought conditions because they take up all the water before the nearby native plants do. So additionally, Sericea has a lot of tannins. Tannins are a chemical that bind to protein and make that protein unavailable for digestion. Tannins, you are probably most familiar with them. They are what give wine that dry mouthfeel and bitter taste. And they're also found in coffee and tea. And so because of all these tannins, livestock do not want to forage it. It's not their first choice to graze on. So they overgraze any of the nearby surrounding plants, which in turn reduces the biodiversity and competition and allows that Sericea to spread faster. So our final why is it bad slide. You can see the top picture on the left, that is the size of a Sericea seed. And the bottom picture is those seed pods on the plant. So typically, each stem of Sericea produces about 1,000 seeds. Now, when you have an acre of solid Sericea, you're looking at about anywhere from 300 to 850 pounds of seed. And then if you go down to a smaller, in a pound of seed, a Sericea seed, you can find 350,000 seeds. Now, additionally, these seeds can remain viable in the seed bank and in the soil for 20 years or more.
So I'm going to jump in here and talk about some of the misconceptions that I hear regularly about Sericea lespedeza. Most of the misconceptions that I hear are still related to some of the original reasons why it was brought over here in the first place. Because you have to remember that this is still a relatively new invasive species. It's been over here in North America for a really long time, since the 1890s, but it's only been since 1980 that it's been discovered and being treated as an aggressive invasive species. So the first thing that I want to talk about is food for bobwhite, but also just food for wildlife in general. So you would think that a plant that produces 1,000 seeds per stem, thousands of seed per plant, would make a really great food plot plant. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. So they were originally considered a really valuable plant for food for wildlife, but it's not been supported by any scientific research or any practical experience. In fact, these seeds have an extremely low energy content. I've worked with landowners before who would tell me that they would shoot bobwhite or they would harvest a game bird and its crop would be full of Sericea lespedeza seed. And it's true, they do eat Sericea lespedeza, but because of that hard coating on the outside of the seed, it's almost completely indigestible. So the bird's not getting any energy from it, and the most that it's doing is spreading it to other fields. You have Sericea lespedeza in your CRP. You've got some birds that eat it, and then they walk over to your neighbor, and now your neighbor has Sericea lespedeza. That's just typically how Sericea lespedeza is spread. Bobwhites that only have access to Sericea lespedeza can actually starve to death, which is a pretty crazy thing, that they can starve to death with a belly full of seeds. Extensive coverage of Sericea lespedeza can lead to reduced bobwhite survival and reproduction rates. So it's not helping your population, and in fact, it's harming it to have that extensive Sericea lespedeza cover. The next misconception that I want to talk about is for wildlife cover. So this was another one of those things that it was a real positive, it was a real plus for when we originally brought it over here and started planting it for soil erosion and habitat cover in the early 1900s. Is you would look at this picture that I have on the left and think that that's some pretty good habitat. That's some pretty good wildlife cover. It's cover from the overhead, and it's got some room down in the middle or at the ground for chicks to be running around. Lespedeza produces a flower, so you'd think that it'd be good for pollinators, bring in the insects for chicks to run around, but don't be deceived. This is the growing season, picturesque wildlife habitat, but notice how it's outshaded, it's outcompeted every other plant here. So in this photo, you only see Sericea lespedeza. There's no other plant to be seen. And what does that mean as a deciduous plant that looks great in the growing season, but winter comes around? So this is a dormant season photo of Sericea lespedeza in a field where it's outcompeted almost everything else. And you can see straight to the ground. It produces almost no winter cover. There's almost no shelter from the cold for anything, let alone a little bobwhite. So you can see here in the back, it's either blue stem or broom sedge in the back that's been able to get up high enough to where it's not been outshaded, but everything else is pretty much gone, and you're left with almost no wildlife cover when you need it the most. So let's talk about some identification. How do you know if you have this on your property? First thing I want to talk about is just the overall structure of the plant. So this is going to be a pretty bushy type plant. Shrubby, it's deciduous. You'll see on this picture on the left that it's got a bunch of branches. So it's got the main stem and then it branches out quite a bit. This plant can grow between 2 and 5 feet tall. And once it gets pretty thick and it gets tall, it's almost impossible to walk through. It makes it really hard for animals to get through it, to walk through it. And it's just not good habitat. The coarse stems are single or clustered. And the branches of the branches of mature plants are pretty woody. So this one on the left is a pretty mature plant. The main stems and the main branches are going to be pretty woody. On the bottom right, I have a picture of a young Sericea lespedeza plant, and it's pretty herbaceous. If you had livestock, that's about the only life stage that lespedeza has any sort of benefit for it. Livestock will eat it when it's pretty young, but once it gets mature, they're really not interested in touching it. The upper right corner of this is what it's going to look like from afar, with a whole bunch of other Sericea lespedeza when it's formed that monoculture. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are the leaves. So Sericea lespedeza will have a trifoliate leaf. And so what that means is that every leaf is attached to the stem, has 3 leaflets. These leaflets are pretty flat, round. They might even have a tip at the end of it, as you can see on that top right picture. And they're pretty well packed onto the stem. These stems are packed with stuff. There's not a lot of empty space. On this picture on the left, it's important to point out each one of those little brown dots is a seed that produces a whole new plant. So you can see how many seeds are just packed onto those branches. All right. The next thing I want to talk about are the flowers. This is going to be the easiest way to know that you have an invasive Sericea lespedeza plant. So the flowers are going to be white. They're not very big at all. The bottom left pictures are kind of what you're going to see if you're just walking through your prairie. But yeah, white flowers, that purple center is what you're going to be looking for as far as flower. And of course, this is what it's going to be looking like when it's dormant. It has that reddish brown coloring to it, but it stands upright when it's dormant. So especially the woody plants, they're all going to still be standing upright. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk about a commonly confused plant that gets confused with Sericea lespedeza, and this is slender lespedeza, also known as slender bush clover. I like to refer to this as Sericea lespedeza's friendly cousin. It is a native lespedeza. This one stands between 2 and 3 feet tall, so it's a little bit of a smaller plant. And this makes great food for quail, turkey, deer, rabbits, all kinds of wildlife. This is a really awesome plant. You might even find it in your seed mixes. Pollinators love the flowers, and it actually enriches the nitrogen in the soil. So I wanted to talk about the few main ways that I use to tell Sericea lespedeza from slender lespedeza, because if you're out there and you're doing a spot herbicide spray or you're really targeting Sericea, you want to make sure that you're not targeting these native lespedezas, because we do have native lespedezas. So the first thing is just overall structure, overall appearance. The native lespedeza here on the bottom is usually only going to have one stem. Sericea, the invasive lespedeza, is going to be pretty branchy and pretty shrubby. The next thing to look at would be the leaves. So the leaf on the Sericea lespedeza, of course, is going to be more rounded, more flat. They're also going to be smaller. Now, of course, that is relative. You really can't use that as an identification if you're not experienced with what the other option is, but Sericea lespedeza is going to have a smaller leaf than slender lespedeza. I also want to point out something about the leaf venation. This is how I generally always tell what I have and what I'm looking at. So when I say leaf venation, it sometimes takes a good pair of eyes to be able to figure this out, but if you can pluck a leaf off and hold it up to the sun, you'll see the veins on the leaf, right? So Sericea lespedeza will have straight leaf venation every time. It has that main vein, and then it comes straight off the main vein to the edges. Whereas slender lespedeza will have that main vein, but then it will be webbed on the edges. So this is what I use to identify Sericea lespedeza versus slender lespedeza every time, because there's some identification or tips that you may use, but sometimes it varies plant per plant. This is something that's going to be the same. 95% of the time, this is going to be the same every time. So that's a good way to tell for sure what you have. Next thing I want to talk about is the petiole. And the petiole is basically the little stem that attaches the leaf to the main branch. So on Sericea lespedeza, you'll have a shorter petiole, and on slender lespedeza, you're going to have a much longer petiole. Again, this is something that's relative. It's a lot easier to tell one from another if you have both plants sitting in front of you. I would suggest using a couple of these identification tips at once. You don't want to just pick one, memorize one, and stick with that, because again, there's variation between plant to plant. But if you can put all of these together, then you're going to come up with a much more accurate identification. The last thing that I wanted to talk about for identification are the flowers. 10 times out of 10, this is the best way to identify a native lespedeza from an invasive lespedeza. 10 times out of 10, invasive lespedezas are going to have white flowers. The native lespedezas don't have white flowers. Most of the time they'll have purple flowers. It does take for, you have to be looking at the plant in a certain time of year when the flower is blooming. That's going to be kind of mid-July to October. But this is the most surefire way to tell one plant from the other.
Let's see. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about management now. So the biggest thing with managing Sericea is early detection. So early detection is incredibly important because it doesn't take long at all, but like it can take a year to 2 years for the picture on the left, where it's just a couple small patches or even just one or two bushes here and there, to turn into the picture on the right, just because of how many seeds a single plant can produce and how much Sericea degrades the quality of the soil in order to outcompete the native species. So the first management practice we want to talk about is mowing and disking. Our biggest thing for mowing and disking is don't do it. It is pretty much one of the number one reasons we see Sericea spread to new areas especially in managed areas, because these seeds easily can get caught up into your equipment. It is very easy for them to spread to new areas. Now, with mowing, it is sometimes okay to mow before the flowering stage, during that vegetative growth, to knock back the plant, and it may suppress it, but it will not do anything to kill the plant or eradicate the population of Sericea you may have. So this picture is a very common image we see, that is Sericea along this really nice maintained trail. And so this is a side effect of that mowing, disking, to maintain a hiking path or an ATV path, because the seeds get collected by the equipment and it just goes straight through the whole time you're managing this trail. So an important thing, if you ever have to drive an ATV, a UTV, or any kind of equipment through a Sericea patch, you really want to either hose down your equipment or spray it with some compressed air to make sure you don't have any seeds on it, and so you're not spreading it to new areas that don't have any Sericea yet. So next is prescribed fire. Now, in general, prescribed fire promotes Sericea growth and germination, and that's because the fire cracks open the seed pod that the seed shell that Sericea is, and makes it easier for it to grow. But this is also recommended because it will create a flush of seeds growing from the seed bank, seeds growing and germinating in the seed bank, which means you are more likely to exhaust the seed bank a lot faster. This is especially helpful when you have that 20-year seed bank that lasts. So it is incredibly important to follow up a prescribed fire with herbicide to make sure you're killing this new growth. So herbicide, 3 very important things. One is to always read and follow the herbicide label to make sure you are using it correctly and safely. And then Sericea is a broadleaf plant, so you want to use a broadleaf specific herbicide. And then if you have Sericea near any water, you want to use an aquatic herbicide so none of the chemicals are getting into the water supply and harming any aquatic plants and animals. So some herbicide options. First column on the left is the chemical name. And then next column is the effectiveness in its recommended season. And then the third column is its mode of action, or how it affects the plant, because each chemical may have a different way it affects the plant. And this is just to show that each chemical may have the same or different way of affecting the plant. So generally, when you're using herbicide for several years on the same kind of area of plants, you want to change up what herbicide you're using. So you're not using the same mode of action each time, because you don't want the plants there to become resistant to a specific chemical or way it affects the plant. And in general, the most recommended chemical to use against Sericea is a triclopyr and fluoxapyr mix at like a 0.4%. And this is so effective because it uses that 2 modes of action against the plant. So when are the ideal times to spray? First is when you're just using herbicide, is when the plants are producing flower buds and flowering. This is because it takes a lot of energy and nutrients for a plant to produce flowers. So when you're hitting it with herbicide at that time, the plant is more vulnerable to the effects of the herbicide. And so doing that reduces the plant's ability to produce flowers later on, and thus reduces its ability to produce seed. Another time is to spray with herbicide is after a prescribed burn, once the plants are re-emerging. So, and finally, I do want to mention grazing, because goats are one of the only species, other than sometimes sheep do as well, that will willingly graze Sericea, and they can kill adult plants within about 3 years. But you have to be very cautious with timing, because they can easily spread the seeds as well. Another thing, some people will plant Sericea for goats and sheep to forage, because it has been proven to help reduce parasite loads in the sheep and the goats, but it's not something you can solely depend on. And you have to think about how the risk it has to affect other wildlife habitat is much greater than its reward as a forage and a parasite reduction to your livestock. So overall, the best management we've found is a combination of two things. It's a prescribed fire followed by an herbicide application once those plants have reemerged from the ground. And again, depending on how severe your Sericea problem is, this could take several years of doing a burn and then a spray of herbicide. You have to stay on it in order to eradicate Sericea. And then additionally, once you get it down to just a few patches of plants, you can switch to only herbicide spot spraying. And additionally, if you have that really bad infestation of Sericea, most likely once you eradicate it, you will have to reseed just because of how it just because it has outcompeted everything else in the area. So you likely won't have good quality native seeds left in the seed bank. So, schedule for this. We would recommend a prescribed fire in the late summer to early fall. This is because this is when the adult plants are more vigorous. And if you burn them then, they are less like those plants are less likely to survive through the winter. And it'll also destroy any flowers and developing seeds. Then following that, the next spring, the next growing season, is when we would recommend the chemical application to happen. And this is because when you do this combo, the herbicide is going on during that vegetative growth stage, and new growth is often more susceptible to herbicides than some of those older plants are. And so you're getting more of effect by using less herbicide in the area. And again, I want to reiterate, this schedule will take several years to fully eradicate a really bad patch of Sericea. So I also want to put a word of caution. So, this is still relatively new knowledge. We didn't know how bad Sericea is until the 1980s. And again, it's still planted a lot of places, and there are a lot of misconceptions. You can still buy Sericea seeds online. And so, because it's such new information, relatively new information, always double check your seed mixes to make sure you're not planting Sericea lespedeza or any other invasive. This is really important when your intention is to plant a native prairie, that you are only planting mixes that have those native prairie plants in them. So that is the end of our presentation. We would like to open the floor up to any questions you guys may have. Feel free to type them in the chat.
We've also added our contact information to this slide. I am located in the Springfield area. This is my area here in the blue, Sangamon, Christian, Montgomery, Macoupin area. And Rachel is over here in the gray. Her home office is in Cass County. But as you can see, Pheasants Forever has a biologist in every county across the state. So if you're not sure who your biologist is, feel free to reach out to either one of us and we'll put you in contact with who is closest to you.
Oh, okay. Looks like chat is disabled. Sorry, the Q&A. I meant to ask any questions you have in the Q&A, not chat. I'm sorry about that.
chemical
Okay.
names. I can go back to that slide for you.
Mhm.
So these are the chemical names. The highlighted one down here is what's recommended. That's generally going to be Pasture Guard is like a brand name, which you're going to be looking for.
Yeah, and generally also when you if you Google these, or if you have someone else spraying for you, any kind of company that does it will know these chemical names as well.
Yeah, Slender Lesbides is an easy
Yeah.
one to mix up with. That's
Hmm.
I really have to look at it to make sure I'm looking at what I think I'm looking at
Hmm.
when I come across it. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
There's a fair amount in East Central Illinois, a lot in Pike County. I'm finding a lot of in Fulton County and some in Mason County as well.
Once it gets out, it's you've kind of once you have it, you're kind of just managing it so it doesn't take over your whole
Hmm.
um prairie, especially in CRP. It's really hard to get rid of completely. Um, especially if, your neighbor or even your neighbor 10 miles north of you has it, it's really easy for a bird to pick up a seed and fly over your place. So
Yeah.
it's really
It's
tricky like
something,
that.
yeah, it's something you will be battling for a long time once you have it.
I will make a note for the crown vetch for
Yes.
next year. But yeah, if we don't have any more questions,
All
we'll go
right.
ahead and
Thank
call
you.
it.
Yeah, thank you, ladies, and thank you to our audience for popping some questions in there and attending tonight. If anything else does come up, Rachel and Emily did provide their
Mhm.
contact information. But if you are not in either of their coverage areas, you can find your nearest FBB on our website, which is www.ihuntil.com. We have our Team Illinois tab at the top of the page where you can go and find your biologists in their coverage areas. So again, we will be sending an email out with the recording of the presentation as well as a PDF of the presentation. So thank you again, and thank you to Emily and Rachel. Good night, everyone.
Thank you guys.
Thank you guys.